going to talk just about some of our recent work. First, looking at a new sort of national prospective survey of PM2.5 oxidative potential across Canada and some recent results that we recently published. I'll also provide an overview of some of our recent work looking at using images and audio data to predict environmental exposures. And I'll give a quick summary of other projects that are ongoing within my group. So as I'm sure you all know, PM2.5 is a mixture, right? So it includes a bunch of different stuff of a certain size. So it includes metals and organics. It's a bit of a weird pollutant, right? Because it's not just one thing. It literally is just a mix of stuff of a certain size. And we treat it as if it's the same thing, but there are variations in the composition of PM2.5, both within cities and between cities, that likely have an important impact on the health effects of the particles, but that really isn't taken into consideration in any way in terms of regulations or information provided to people in terms of public health. So oxidative stress is thought to be one of the main mechanisms that are sort of driving air pollution health effects. We know that it contributes to a range of different sort of physiological mechanisms, so things like changes in autonomic function, endothelial function, systemic inflammation. And I think one of the main reasons that air pollution contributes to so many different kinds of outcomes is because of this oxidative stress mechanism, because we know that oxidative stress is basically involved in a number of different diseases. And so I think what sort of air pollution is doing, it's sort of tipping the balance in terms of causing oxidative stress in the body, which can lead to a range of different outcomes. So some of you might be familiar, but there's a metric that we call PM2.5 oxidative potential. That's really just meant as a way to estimate the ability of particles to cause oxidative stress. And so this is it's an in vitro assay that takes a filter sample, exposes it to different chemicals, and looks at the ability of the particles to deplete these different compounds. And this allows us to sort of move beyond the assumption that all particles are equally harmful. So there's three assays that we generally use. There's the glutathione depletion, the ascorbate depletion, and the DTT depletion, dithiothiol. And so the idea is that this assay is sort of meant to mimic what exists already in our lungs. So we have a lung lining fluid that contains antioxidants, including glutathione and ascorbate, that's there as a sort of first line of defense against inhaled pollutants. And basically, the assay that's used to measure oxidative potential is sort of meant to mimic that. The idea being that if the particles are more able to deplete these antioxidants, maybe they're more biologically active and possibly harmful. And I don't actually do these assays. I work with chemists that actually do this analysis as collaborators. So in the past, we've worked with Crystal Gaudry, who's now at Yale, and Greg Evans at the University of Toronto. And so we've been doing work on oxidative potential for a number of years now. This is just a bit of a summary of some of the things we found so far. And so on the left is from a case crossover study looking at the impact of PM2.5, daily changes in PM2.5 and the risk of myocardial infarction. And you can see that as the oxidative potential increases for the same increment in daily exposure, the magnitude of the health risk goes up in terms of myocardial infarction. And on the right, you see a similar pattern for asthma. So the blue curve is the relationship between daily PM2.5 and emergency room visits for asthma when the oxidative potential of the particles is high, and the black curve showing no relationship is when it's low. And we've seen similar things for birth outcomes in a study led by colleague Eric Levine at Health Canada, as well as in studies of personal exposures in asthmatic kids. This was a panel study that was conducted where we had personal measures of PM2.5, and when we looked at health effects of those mass concentrations on inflammation in children's lungs, we didn't really see any effect when we looked at just the mass, but when we incorporated the information on oxidative potential, we see an effect. So it seems like this metric is really sort of modifying the mass effect. But previously, several of these studies, well, all the studies were limited in that we didn't have prospective measurements of oxidative potential. So we had really what were convenient samples, and we had to assume sort of stationary spatial differences in the oxidative potential of the particles. And so between 2016 and 2018, Health Canada funded a large national scale study of monthly variations in PM2.5 oxidative potential across Canada. So we had 40 locations across Canada, and all of these samples were collected by volunteers across the country. So I really called everyone I knew across Canada working in air pollution and sort of begged them to agree to collect samples and ship them back to us. And surprisingly, people did this for 2 years, and we collected about 1,000 monthly samples across the country, with sites in almost every province and territory, with a couple exceptions. So I'm sure that there are people on this call that were volunteers that collected samples. So really could not have been done without all the help of these volunteers. So I just want to show you briefly this little animation showing how the monthly oxidative potential of the PM varies across space and time. And so on the y-axis here, we have the DTT metric. On the x-axis, we have the GSH metric, and then the color is the ascorbate metric. And this will just show how they move around throughout the year, right? So each of these little boxes on the plot is a city. And up here, it's just counting through the months of the year. And so you can see that there's a lot of variation in the oxidative potential of the particles, both between cities and within cities, right? So the same city moves around throughout the year, and obviously the different cities are in different places on the plot. And so this is good for us in terms of health studies, because it means we can possibly exploit some of this variation in the oxidative potential in terms of trying to really refine and understand the health effects of PM2.5. The other thing we see, and this is again sort of showing the same thing, but there are places that are sort of always high. So Trail in British Columbia has a large base metal smelter, and it was consistently very high in terms of the glutathione-related oxidative potential across all the seasons. But there were other sites that sort of moved up and down. So the site in Athabasca Valley, was high in winter, but then went down in spring and summer, and then went back up in autumn. So maybe the source there is, related to, heating or something during the winter time. The other thing was that having the highest PM2.5 mass concentration really didn't tell you much about the oxidative potential of the particles. So again, if you see, say, Kamloops had the highest PM2.5 mass concentration, but Trail had the highest oxidative potential in terms of two of the three metrics that we looked at, but about half the level of mass. So looking just at the mass doesn't necessarily tell you much about the oxidative potential of the particles. So the first study that we've done as part of these new sort of national level data collection for oxidative potential is a case crossover study that we recently published in EHP. And so the goal of this study was really to see how these monthly variations in oxidative potential and some specific components of PM modify the mass effect. So the exposure is still the mass in this study. We're still looking at sort of day-to-day changes in the PM2.5 mass. We wanted to see how that mass effect changed across different levels of oxidative potential and also different components. And for the components, we looked specifically at several transition metals and sulfur together. And we did this because there's a recent paper showing that possibly the combination of metals and sulfur is what is really important for oxidative potential. So in our database, we had monthly estimates of OP, but we also had monthly estimates of transition metals and sulfur. So we're able to incorporate this additional information to try and see how these mass effects are modified by these components. So the study included about 90,000 cases of acute cardiovascular events. And we limited it to cases that were living within 5 kilometers of one of our monitoring sites, just to make sure that we could limit sort of any kind of misclassification as much as possible while still having enough cases to do the study. And so we ran our models across strata of monthly OP measurements, as well as metals and sulfur, adjusting for oxidant gases and temperature. And we conducted the analysis separately by for men and women, because there were just no associations at all in women. So PM wasn't associated with acute cardiovascular events in women. So we separated it out between by biological sex. And so when we did this, we saw several interesting results. So this shows just the odds ratios for a 10 microgram per cubic meter change in PM 2.5. So the dots and the 95% confidence intervals all reflect the same change in mass concentration. And the plot on the left shows results when the copper content was high, so above the median. And then what you see is that even when the copper or metal content is high, you still need to have the sulfur content also being elevated. So the green line here on the left panel is saying that, you know, even when copper is high, the mass effect really isn't contributing much to acute cardiovascular events unless the sulfur is also high. So it seems that the combination of the components, the transition metals and sulfur, is what is sort of important. It's not one or the other, but you sort of need both. And when we looked at oxidative potential, we saw very similar results. So having high oxidative potential on its own wasn't enough. You needed the high oxidative potential and the high sulfur. And so it looked like the oxidative potential metric was really capturing the sort of same pattern as the metals. And when we explored this a little bit further, so this is just showing a different metric of OP showing the same pattern. But when we explored this a little bit further in terms of the correlation between the oxidative potential metric and the metals, what we see is that the sulfur content of the particles influences how correlated the oxidative potential metric is with the metals. So what you see on the left is that the correlation with between the oxidative potential metric and the metals is much stronger when sulfur is higher. And so what this suggests is that the reason that oxidative potential actually captures some of the heterogeneity in the mass effect is that it's capturing the variation in metals when they sort of matter most, when there's also high sulfur. And so this is providing a bit more information on sort of why the oxidative potential metric works. And it's also nice because we already measure components for PM, and we can model these things, and we don't really measure oxidative potential or model it particularly well on any kind of large scale. So the fact that we can sort of use some of the components that we already know about to inform some of the spatial differences in the mass effects is really could be quite useful. Now, the other thing that we noted in this study was that the mass proportion of sulfur in the particles, it increases as the PM 2.5 mass concentration decreases. And the reason this might be important is that it could help to explain a pattern that we see around the world where the concentration response curve for PM 2.5 and mortality, say, is generally steeper at lower concentrations. So you tend to see this sort of steeper increase at low levels, and then it sort of flattens off as you go higher. And this could be, this sort of pattern could be explained if what we're seeing is really real, right? So for a given metal content, the metals might be more available at lower mass concentration because the sulfur content is higher. And so we didn't specifically test this in this study, but it is interesting that we see this sort of consistent pattern of a higher mass proportion of sulfur at lower mass concentrations. And we saw this in our data, and we also checked the US data as well, and we saw the same pattern. So it's really just something to think about and why we kind of see that pattern in terms of the concentration response around the world. So just as a summary of the study, we're still working on other aspects of the data set, but our first analysis really suggests that all PM 2.5 is not created equal, and that the combined transition metal and sulfur content really appears to be important, at least for the acute cardiovascular effects in men. I don't have a clear explanation of why we didn't see any effects in women, but I can only tell you that it was very, very consistent in all the models we looked at. There just really wasn't much going on in terms of acute cardiovascular health risks among women. I don't know why that line is there. But I also want to briefly note that we use this data to also develop the first national surface of oxidative potential across Canada. And so this work was done by a postdoctoral student, Jun Wei Zhu at, she's in Halifax at Dalhousie. She's a student of Randall Martin's. And so she took our data across Canada and she linked it with components from the GeosChem model and developed these models sort of estimating the oxidative burden of the particles across Canada for these three metrics. And the models do pretty well. So the R-squareds are sort of 60, 70%. And the main determinants of the predictions for the different metrics, they vary between the metrics. So the oxidative, the DTT measure here was driven more by organic carbon, whereas the glutathione and ascorbate metrics were driven by sort of black carbon, and arsenic here is just I think a marker for base metal smelting. And when you map these out, you can see that there are spatial variations in these oxidative potential measures across the country that differ in the pattern that you see for mass. And so we are in the process of incorporating some of these surfaces in our ongoing cohort work. I'm just going to exit here. I don't know why this blue line is magically showing up on. Can anyone see that?
Yeah, it's on.
Is that on my slides or is that on your end? That was like it didn't exist there before.
Yeah, I can see it, but I don't
I can't remove it, so I think it's on your end. That's fine. I just didn't want to make sure it was on my end. So
okay.
Yeah, sorry, I can't get rid of it.
Let me.
So this national model is nice. It's a kind of a nice first step, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's based only on 40 sites across Canada. And so I think it's a good first look at how these metrics vary over a large spatial scale, and we are going to include them in some of our future epidemiological studies, but with the caveat that I think we still have a lot to learn in terms of the sort of broad spatial variations that you probably can't learn with just 40 sites. And so actually this year we are working with Stats Canada to link all of our monitoring data as well as that national surface to the CanCheck cohort. So this is our national census cohort where we follow people for mortality. The goal of this study is really to look and see how these components modify the long-term health effects of PM as well as the shape of the concentration response relationships. So now we'll move into some of the work we've been doing on predicting exposures using deep learning. And I'm sure as you all know, when you're doing any kind of epidemiological investigation of environmental exposures, one of the main challenges is always how do you assign exposures to people, particularly large numbers of people, in a way that provides good reliability and accuracy, but also in a way that's sort of cost effective. You can't do personal monitoring for the entire CanCheck cohort. So you need a way of assigning exposures in that make sense, that you believe and that are effective, but that are also cost effective. And so traditionally, this has been done, either by using sort of physically based models that have emissions information, and you model how those emissions move around in space and time, and assign them to your grid squares, or sort of traditional land use regression models where you put a bunch of monitors across a city, extract land use data around all the monitors, and then develop a statistical model to predict exposures where you don't have any measurements. But there's a number of limitations to these approaches. Either you might not have all the emissions data that you'd like to have, or the geographic information system data that you need they're generally available on a limited spatial scale. So most of our work is done in Montreal and Toronto, and there are millions of people that live outside the formal boundaries of Toronto, but often our models, as shown here, are limited to just the formal city boundaries because we lose the GIS data outside those areas. And also the GIS data doesn't really capture the complexity of the environment sort of as we experience it. And so over the past several years, we started thinking about, well, maybe we could just use the picture. because images capture a lot of information about what we're exposed to, right? So I mean, a busy street looks a lot different than a residential area. And this is true both from a satellite point of view and a street level point of view, right? So an industrial area looks different than sort of an agricultural region or a small town. And so there's a lot of information on possible exposures that are sort of embedded in these images. And the same is true for sound, right? It's not maybe not something that we think about a lot, but the sound that you hear, and I don't mean noise, I mean really just the sound of the city tells you something about what's going on in terms of your exposure, right? So a park sounds a lot different than a highway or a construction site. And there's exposure information in that audio signal. And what really convinced me, this was a paper I sort of came across on what was called acoustic scene classification, where they really just try and predict where you are based on the sound. And it turns out you can do a really good job of predicting where someone is just based on what the place sounds like. And if you can predict location based on sound, then you can predict exposure, because location and exposure are intimately linked, right? So if you can predict whether you're at the beach, on the bus, in your car, at the grocery store, you can say something about what you're exposed to in terms of the audio signal. And so we really have been working hard to sort of utilize both of these sources in terms of estimating exposures. And the way we do this is we use what are called convolutional neural networks that take images as input and then predict whatever it is you're trying to predict. So you need large databases of images that are labeled with, you know, whatever pollutants you're trying to measure. And briefly, I'll go over how these work. So essentially, these models are made up of many, many millions of parameters that are trained in an iterative process. And basically, what happens with the convolutional neural networks is that each layer has a number of these little filters that are basically just a small matrix that sort of extracts some sort of information out of the image that you put in. So all digital images are just a matrix of numbers. And so these little filters, basically, some of them learn shapes, some of them learn colors. They get more complex as you kind of get deeper into the model. But essentially what you're doing is you're trying to train these sort of smaller matrices to extract out useful information in terms of predicting whatever it is you're interested in predicting. And so the way this works is that you have a large database, each that's labeled with, say, an air pollution concentration. That image gets fed into the network. You come up with a prediction, you compare it to the truth, and then the model goes back and says, how can I update all my weights so I do a little bit better in my prediction on this example? And you just do that over and over again until you reach some kind of minimum value in the loss function, or basically you train it until you sort of aren't getting any better in terms of your predictions. And this is why we need large data sets, because these models have millions of parameters that need to be trained, and so you need a lot of data just to support the process. And in terms of audio data, what we do is we use the raw wave file, but then we convert that into a spectrogram, which is really just a picture of the sound that captures how loud it is at various frequencies, and then we basically feed that spectrogram into the networks, just like a regular image. So the first study that we did on this process was looking at just to see if we could predict global variations in annual average PM2.5 based just on a satellite image. And so what we did here is that we took existing WHO data for PM2.5 and just downloaded satellite images for all of those points and trained a model to predict the annual average concentration. And we run all of our models in Keras. It's a pretty user-friendly package. We started in R, but moved to Python. But it's really something that you can pick up and learn using just resources online. I didn't know anything about deep learning a couple of years ago, and I sort of was able to figure it out in a more or less proficient way to get started, and then hired people to help me out when we really had to get into doing it in a more systematic way. But here you see the sort of measured versus predicted PM2.5, and turns out you can explain about 75% of the variation in global PM2.5 just with a satellite image, which to us was surprising. But we also wanted to compare our results to sort of other models that are used. And so we contacted the people that had developed the DIMAC model that's used by the Global Burden of Disease project. And they provided us their estimates at the same locations where we had our predictions. And the two compare pretty well. So the R squared is about 80%, slope is close to 1. And so that was reassuring in that our model, based just on an image, was sort of doing pretty well in terms of predicting the annual average compared to this much more complex model that incorporates satellite data, chemical transport models, land use information, all kinds of things. So the other thing that, oh, sorry, that was back. The other thing we did is that we did a comparison of the models globally just to see if there were places where maybe they don't line up so well. And what we saw is that the two models disagreed the most in places where the DIMAC model predictions were based on PM10 data. So places like India and Turkey, the DIMAC model is actually based on PM10 data. And those were the places where our models disagreed the most. And this was, even though we'd like them to agree better in those places, it was sort of reassuring that, you know, the places where they didn't match up were places where they were based on fundamentally different data. So that was sort of reassuring again that we were actually predicting and learning something useful about sort of what was happening on the ground in terms of PM2.5 emissions. So after the PM2.5 project, I was contacted by some colleagues in Belgium who told me about this large project they had in Flanders where they sent out 20,000 nitrogen dioxide measurements. Sorry. And they said, hey, well, you know, can you do that here? And so I said, well, we can certainly try. And so they sent us the lat longs for their 20,000 NO2 measurements. And again, we downloaded satellite images for those. And we trained a similar model for NO2. And again, we see that this works really well. So you have a model that can predict about 80% of the variability in annual average NO2 across this portion of Belgium. So that's shown on the left. Then on the right, we also develop what are called these gradient weighted class activation maps. Essentially, it's a way of visualizing which portions of the image are being used to make the predictions. And so on the top, or on the left column, I guess you see that's the actual image that's going into the model. And then on the right, you see which portions of those images were important in terms of making the classification. And so the top image is a place that has low NO2. And on the right, you see the portions of the image that are being sort of used to make that decision are places that are kind of like just green spaces. And what's interesting is the part that's not highlighted is the road in this image. Whereas in the bottom image, that's a high NO2 area. It's sort of road segments in different parts of the block that are highlighted. So again, we do this mostly just to make sure that what the image is looking at actually makes sense in terms of what we understand about the sources of the pollutant that we're looking at. Just a couple other examples of how we're using this model, this method. So this is an example from a paper that we basically trained a deep learning model to predict a land use regression model. And that allows us to expand the spatial scale of the model. So this isn't so important if you have an outcome with a lot of numbers. So if you're looking at mortality, it's probably not an issue. But if you're looking at something like brain cancer, where there are small numbers of events, you might want to expand the scale of your predictions as large as possible so that you can include as many cases as possible. And so this was just another sort of application of what we think might be a useful way of applying this method. Recently, my PhD student, Marshall, used a similar method of linking up satellite and street level images with mobile monitoring in a study we did in Bucaramanga, Colombia. And what was really neat about this approach was that what we saw was that the models that were based on the deep learning approach were a lot more robust to sort of spatial variations in the errors. And so to test this, we did the sort of validation split by different spatial segments. And on the left, you can see that the variation in the model performance was a lot less variable and a lot better than just the standard land use regression model. with the best results obtained by actually combining both of the predictions. And so the images, both street level and satellite, seem to be sort of capturing information that helps kind of make the model more robust and less maybe vulnerable to spatial variations in the errors, which you really want to avoid in any kind of health study, because it could be differential kind of exposure error that could severely bias your estimates in unpredictable ways. So all of that was related to sort of annual average longer term exposures, but what about short-term exposures? So we also did a paper looking at seeing if we could use this method to predict short-term exposures in ultrafine particles. And we picked ultrafine particles because they vary a lot in both time and space. And so they depend a lot on sort of strong sources like a big diesel bus or something that if that goes by, it can greatly increase your exposure over a short period of time. Often block to block, these exposures vary quite a lot. And so we thought this would be a good challenge in terms of trying to develop a model to predict these. And what we did is we collected a whole lot of data in Montreal. So we had GoPro cameras that were used to collect the images and the audio data. And with each monitoring location, we had measures of ultrafine particle concentration, ultrafine particle size, and noise. And in total, we had about 150,000 image audio samples to develop these models. And what we did here was sort of a hybrid approach. So what we did is we trained the CNN, just as I had shown you previously, with each image and audio spectrogram labeled with a 10-second average noise or UFP sample. But because no one really cares about the 10-second average UFP or noise measurement, we averaged the predictions into 5-minute intervals and then developed a traditional sort of regression model that included the image predictions and the audio predictions as well as weather in the model. And so we did this for a number of reasons, but it also allowed us to look and see which prediction, the image or the audio, was playing a stronger role. And you can think about this almost like creating an instrument, right? So we basically create an instrument that says, this is our best guess at what the concentration is based on what the place looks like. This is our best guess based on what it sounds like. And then you can combine those with other information to get a sort of final prediction. And when you do this, it turns out it works pretty well. So here you can see just the scatter plots of the concentration, the size, and the noise level. And we did the validation split and the test sets in two different ways. First, we developed a model saying, let's develop and test it as though we were developing a model to apply at the same location. And when you do that, you can explain about 70% of the variability in the UFP count, about 80% for the size, and about 98% for the noise. And so for the noise, it's not surprising that it works really well because you actually have the audio signal in there. But if you look at the far right column, you can see that even if you don't include the audio and you include just the image, you can still predict about 80% of the variation in the noise just based on the image. And so that was also a bit surprising. And for ultrafines, the audio signal was as important or more important than the image. And originally the audio thing was, I think, a bit of I thought it was a cool idea, but I wasn't sure it would actually work. But having done this a lot more now, I can kind of see why it works well, and that the audio spectrograms are a lot more stable. They don't depend on the lighting. They don't depend if there's a raindrop on the lens. They don't depend on the angle. Images are really kind of messy. And so I think it's just easier to learn the patterns from the spectrograms than the images. And when you do this evaluation, sort of developing a model in one location and testing it at a different location at different times, the model performance goes down, but it's still pretty good. So you can still predict explain about 60% of the variation in 5-minute average ultrafines and 80–90% for size and noise. So this to us was pretty surprising because an ultrafine monitor costs about $15,000 or $20,000. And if you can predict 5-minute mean concentrations based just on what the place looks and sounds like, that's pretty good. Could provide useful information, I think, for studies going forward. And this is, again, one of those gradient weighted class activation maps, again, just showing how in an image that was classified as having high noise, the model was looking at the truck. So it's sort of saying, you know, we've seen a lot of images with trucks. They've all seem to have high levels. We're going to go with the truck and say that this, you know, is also has high noise. So that makes sense in terms of what the model is learning. So just as a summary, I think we're still a long way from this being probably integrated on any kind of large scale, but I think that images and audio are really kind of an untapped resource of environmental exposure information. They do require a lot of work in sort of developing the training sets, but I think if enough people are doing this, we can probably sort of get together and combine data sets, share models so that you can start from a pre-trained model, which requires less data. As we saw in Colombia, this approach is useful when you don't have a lot of curated GIS data. And again, as we saw in Colombia, the sort of reliability of the predictions over space may be a bit more stable in terms of the errors compared to the traditional land use regression model. The biggest challenge with these models is just how do you deal with all the data and how do you clean all the data and make sure everything is lined up and managed. That's the biggest challenge. It's doable, but you need someone really good at sort of that process. I just want to end showing a little bit of what we're working on now. So sort of building on some of the deep learning model, I've partnered with a company called MyStall to develop this just a solar powered box basically to collect images and audio. And so this is my student Alessia. We're training some new models to predict noise and ultrafines based on the image and audio data collected with this system. The idea being that you could have a network of these across a city to get sort of near real-time estimates based just on sound and pictures. I have another PhD student, Marshall Lloyd, who's working on a project funded by HEI to look at some of the long-term health effects of ultrafines and black carbon. That will also include a deep learning model development in comparison to sort of other types of models and how those models perform in terms of health risks. So that'll be coming out in the next year or so. My PhD student, Jill Korsiak, is in the process of linking historical forest fire locations to the CanCheck cohort. So in this study, we're interested not so much in air pollution, but the sort of mix of horrible things that come off of forest fires. There's a lot of carcinogens that come off of forest fires. And so we wanted to see if sort of long-term residential proximity to forest fires was impacting cancer incidence across the country. And so we have forest fire data from Natural Resources Canada going back to the 1980s. And she's following CanCheck members from 96 to 2016. And she's still working on this paper, but I think it's going to be some interesting findings from that as well. Another PhD student, Susanna Ripley, is looking more at within city variations in some interesting exposure metrics. So oxidative potential, but also a metric called magnetite. So magnetite is basically iron oxide particles that are formed in sort of high temperature combustion, also things like breakware. And these particles have actually been found in people's brains. And so she is developing models for these exposures, but also applying these models in studies to look at things like brain tumors and cardiovascular mortality. Finally, we recently got a new grant to look at really high resolution variations in temperature in the summer months in Montreal and Toronto. So we'll be developing some new models to really understand sort of fine scale variations in heat across the cities, applying these models in new studies of mental health, cardiorespiratory outcomes, and also developing some deep learning models to see if we can provide some tools that cities can use to identify problem areas just based on what a place looks like. So with that, I just want to say thank you and thank all of my funders and collaborators. You can see the number of people across the country that were involved in collecting, especially the oxidative potential data, and all of my academic collaborators at Health Canada and different universities, particularly Chris Hong and Pedro Pinheiro, who helped a lot with the deep learning stuff. Greg Evans and his team who did all the oxidative potential measures for the opera study. So yeah, thank you so much. I will unshare my screen and we can chat.